Hi, welcome to Future Insights Network podcast. This week's guest is Professor Tom Davenport, who is President's Distinguished Professor in Information Technology and Management at Babson College. Tom, welcome.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. I'm Tim Coulthard.
I'm Maria Villablanca.
So we're going to look at some of the interesting aspects of and applications of AI, mainly in this discussion. I know you've got a book coming out called The AI Advantage, which is very much focused around this practical application of the technology. Before we get into some of those interesting topics, maybe you could just tell us a bit about your background and your career story so far to set the scene.
Sure. Well, in some sense, I've been doing the same thing for a long time: research, consulting, writing, teaching. But the topics have sometimes changed, and I started with business process reengineering when that was a hot topic, and then did some work with ERP systems and knowledge management. And for, 15 or 20 years, I did analytics and big data work, and that sort of led me into AI over the past 5 years or so. I tried some work with AI during the last AI spring, and then obviously the interest died out, so I stopped working on it. But obviously, a lot of people are interested in it again today.
Absolutely. I mean, so we've got a copy of your book, and it's been fascinating reading it. And I'll say, besides the fact that it's very topical to what our members are dealing with right now in terms of the cognitive revolution or the cognitive and AI spring, as you talk about, what I found really interesting about the book was how practical it is, how you can give real practical examples of how people are implementing things and what to do about it and what to set up for their own businesses so that they can use this effectively too. What I'd like to first start out with really is you start out your book with a statement, and you actually end the book, the last or second to last statement, if you don't mind, on your book. In your book, it says, "A company with no AI capabilities is as foolish as a company with no internet presence, or one that insists on using analog, paper-based business processes." That's a very, very big statement. I mean, one of the things that I've noticed in the book as well is that you have so many surveys that you reference that show a high awareness rate for the importance of AI and cognitive. And I think if we were to poll our members, a lot of them would say, yeah, we definitely think it's very important. But so few organizations are actually making any real and significant investments in this. Why do you think that is, and how do you think that can change?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I don't know if it's high or low. I was just working on another little piece this morning where I reviewed all the surveys, and it looks like in the US about 30% of large enterprises are doing, moderately, at least substantial work with AI. And I saw another survey this morning, and across 14 countries, it was about 20% on average. So, as with any technology, it takes a while to really get, going in a substantial way. I think a lot of people do view it as sort of experimental, which some aspects of it are, but some have been around for 20 or 30 years, like some aspects of machine learning. So I don't think that's necessarily a reason to wait. I think it's mostly an issue of awareness and knowledge of what the technologies can do. It's interesting. I didn't focus on it too much in the book, but in some of these surveys that I've done, most of which I worked on with Deloitte, where I'm a senior advisor, the level of excitement is really high, and positive feelings. And, when one of the questions we asked, do you think AI is overhyped? I don't know, maybe 20% said yes. Then we said, do you think it's underhyped? And twice as many said, yes, it's underhyped. So, and the more experience they had, the more positive they were about it. So I think people are quite bullish who have used it and used it in the right way.
One of the interesting concepts that you've outlined in the book is this idea of moonshots versus low-hanging fruits. And I think in the early days of the technology, some of the claims and ambitions were lofty and may for the right reasons probably, but didn't necessarily pan out. And I sense that you're now advocating a much more pragmatic grassroots application for this.
I do. I start the book with several sort of stories about organizations that pursued moonshots and were not terribly successful with them. Attempts to cure cancer or to provide a very high level of investment advice at a bank. But at those same companies, there were also less ambitious projects that are working quite well.
Yeah.
And then I talk about Amazon, and arguably one of the most technologically capable organizations on the planet. And even they have struggled a bit with their moonshots, this Amazon Go store that supposedly doesn't have any people working in it, although when I went there were 3 people working in it.
It's probably more than a lot of stores.
Yeah, more than most convenience stores, certainly.
Yeah.
And the drone, delivering packages by drone, maybe that'll happen someday, but it seems to be a ways off. But as Jeff Bezos said in 2017, most of their machine learning activities have been, I think, quietly but meaningfully improving core operations. So if that's good for Amazon, it's probably good for everybody. And that's really the approach that I take in the book.
I mean, I was really struck by the fact that one of the examples of an organization using AI is NASA, who are literally capable of a moonshot, maybe not so much now, but certainly in the past. Yet they're using AI in things like back office functions, accounting, HR processes, and that kind of stuff. So if you wanted to encapsulate what you should potentially be doing in a realistic sense, that's an amazing example.
It is. I love the quote from the guy who was managing the back office automation project. He said, "This is not rocket science, and we would know." And they are, I mean, to be fair to them, they are doing some work with Google and Intel and so on celestial navigation as well, which is, I don't know, maybe that comes
Sounds more like
to a moonshot, but they are also pursuing some prosaic but important, I think, applications in the back office.
Do you think perhaps maybe some companies might find it a bit of a daunting prospect? The AI cognitive is such a big conundrum for some companies, or maybe so scary a prospect because they're thinking of a moonshot, because they're thinking a big claim. You offer a lot of practical steps on how an organization can get started with this. Can you perhaps expand on that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, there are more and more ways to get started. And if you, since I came from an analytics-oriented background, if you want to do statistical machine learning, at least the more straightforward versions of it, that's a very, I think, almost easy extension of traditional, regression analysis and so on, which most organizations don't find daunting at all. And then the other angle that's growing, I think, quite rapidly is this idea that buy some software from your transaction vendor that add some AI capabilities to what they did already. So maybe it's Salesforce Einstein or SAP Leonardo or something along those lines. And then the data is already there. Yeah. The user interface is pretty much the same one as the software had before. And if you want to do predictive lead scoring for many organizations, it's going to be easier to get that from Salesforce than it is to build it yourself and somehow develop an API to your Salesforce system or something.
And I think you also talk about this in the book in terms of what challenges companies may have in implementing cognitive. I mean, we look at some of our members, don't we? And they're running very large and complex supply chains or manufacturing facilities across multiple geographies, multiple languages. Sometimes these companies are 100 years old or more. They have legacy systems. They have issues with business processes. What can a company, or what can a supply chain director or manufacturing director, someone who really wants to implement digital transformation and cognitive within their business, what can they do to overcome those issues?
Well, I mean, it's still, of course, the case that the dirty secret of AI, as it was the dirty secret of analytics, is that you typically are going to spend most of your time working with data and getting it ready. But there's some good news that I describe in the book, in that we're starting to be able to use AI to help with those issues. Probabilistic matching, for example, to kind of integrate data. I talk about GE doing that with all of its suppliers and doing it much more quickly than we've been able to do it with these very labor-intensive data integration approaches in the past. I've been working, since I finished the book, I've been working with a number of companies on robotic process automation, which, as I say in the book, not the smartest technology, and some people would argue maybe it's not even AI, but it works quite well. And companies are starting to use what was a somewhat exotic technology called process mining to even find out how the current process is performing, and that uses AI as well. So I think there are a lot of ways that AI can help you do these kind of basic things that were inhibiting companies from really transforming their processes or their organizations.
And there are a lot of examples that you've given around the first footholds, and some of those RPAs you mentioned, the first footholds being around the automation of seemingly quite mundane tasks, back office functions, chatbots, this kind of stuff. It feels like those are ways to sort of break down the psychological barrier of we are doing AI, to do something quite small, to make it a success, and then you get some traction and buy-in further up the organization. Is that what you tend to see? Is that sort of start small and then scaling from there?
Yeah, one of the consultants I interviewed at one point described robotic process automation as the gateway drug for AI.
I like that. I really like that.
And then since then, I work with this organization in the US that studies processes called APQC, and they've done some research suggesting that it really is the gateway drug for AI, that a lot of organizations start with that and then move to more sophisticated forms already, even though we're early in the game for AI.
Yeah, and in the how of that, you mentioned that bringing seemingly quite disparate elements together, whether that's small pilot projects in a big organization happening at different points, bring them together into a kind of cognitive center of excellence that allows that structure to be embedded in the organization. Does that tend to be where this successful projects sort of lead to?
I think so. I mean, who knows if the projects lead to that, or if that leads to the projects, maybe some of both. But if you think this is an important and valuable resource, then why wouldn't you establish some sort of group to help manage it? If you already had some analytics groups, then adding on some AI is not going to be a sort of revolutionary change. And I was somewhat surprised. I am just analyzing a new survey from Deloitte, just data recently gathered, and it said 37%. We don't have the non-US data in yet, but the US data said 37% of large companies said they had some sort of cognitive center of excellence, which seemed high to me, but
compared to how many are actually supposedly using it.
Yeah, they think they do anyway. And so I think it certainly makes sense that you would establish an organization like that.
Can I ask about people for a second, in terms of, I've got two questions with this. One is, you talk about in the book who are the adopters and who are the people that are looking to push AI and cognitive within the organizations. You said the C-suite, if I remember correctly, were very big proponents of this. Do you think that they really have a genuine understanding of the implications of launching a cognitive project? That's question one. And question two is, how do you then bring everyone else along with you to then deliver a good and successful cognitive project?
Well, the answer to your first question, do they have a good understanding, I think is generally no. And that is a problem. I mean, a number of companies and surveys have said lack of understanding of our senior management of these technologies is a barrier to our success. So some companies that I've worked with, I don't know how many in total have done it, have had educational programs for the C-suite or the top 10 executives or whatever, which I think is a very good idea. And I mean, frankly, there have been a fair number of cases where, I don't know, a board member would hear from a vendor, probably one vendor more than any others, that, oh, you really need to be doing something cognitive or you're going to lose out, or, AI is the latest thing, you've got to adopt it. It's sort of the airline magazine school of management too, basically, they read something about it. And that can be dangerous, I think, because they don't really have much of a sense of what technologies are well suited for what purposes, and what's the appropriate level of ambition about it. And so it can be quite problematic unless you go a little further in your educational efforts. And how do you bring everybody else along? I think this is related to the sort of the people who do the work issue. I think everybody's a little nervous about this stuff now, in some cases with good reason, in some cases maybe not. But I think organizations should let their people know what their kind of long-range plans are with this topic and how they can start to add value. And I think maybe send some reassuring messages out about, we don't foresee large-scale, job loss or anything with this stuff.
Well, I was going to ask about that, because you talk about it being overhyped potentially, and there is a sense that it might be overhyped. Maybe some of the concerns surrounding the AI argument is this fear that automation is going to replace workers, right? Yet in your book, you give reasons why large-scale automation isn't very likely. Could you perhaps maybe expand on that? And are the workers safe?
Well, yeah, I don't think anybody can afford to be complacent fully about it, but some of your fellow countrymen at Oxford with these data suggesting 47% of US jobs are automatable, and frankly I was a little suspicious when they said only 35% of UK jobs are automatable. But we don't really have any idea. I mean, they may be technically automatable, but there was a McKinsey study they started out also with this very high, almost 50% level of jobs being automatable. But they said if you factor in, a couple of years later, they said this, if you factor in all of the other considerations, the cost of automation, the installed base, et cetera, it's more likely that 5% of jobs might be actually automated. So that's been my feeling for a while. And in general, when you talk to managers, automation is not really high on their list of objectives, at least if they're being honest.
Yeah.
Although in this latest 2018 Deloitte survey, it's not going to be published until week after next, I think, but something like 64% of the US participants did say, we'd like to automate as many jobs as possible. So that'll put some fear in some workers.
You did say, I'm sorry, I was just about to jump in on Tim asking a question.
I was just going to observe that the fact is that automation takes work initially. So absolutely. It's not going to be a flip a switch and tomorrow morning X number of workers have gone and they're replaced with automated processes. You've got to invest in the technology, you've got to do the research, you've got to make the changes. So it's not as easy as flipping a switch. And as we know, the reality is that finding time for innovation and change is a massive challenge for leaders. So they've still, it's not going to kind of come overnight and somebody's going to have a horrible shock one morning. And then also these statistics tend to sort of work on the assumption that the existing paradigm will be the same, that nothing else will change, that work will be the same. And
well, but you say that in the book. You say that this automation will create different jobs, won't it?
It will, and we don't know exactly how many, but interestingly, I think in 10 years in one survey, the number of people saying that new jobs will be created was higher than the number of people saying that there will be large-scale job displacement.
Yeah.
So nobody knows exactly how this will all net out, but I think, and not so much in this recent book, but in my last book, I said, you really need to be thinking now about how you're going to add value to these technologies, learning as much as you can about them. And that book was more oriented to individual workers, and this one is more focused on enterprises. But And I think enterprises can certainly help their people by encouraging them to do that.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at it from a personal point of view, if you were to kind of assess the time-consuming, fairly mundane tasks that we all do, and then think, what could I do with that time in terms of innovation or exploring new ideas or uncovering new forms of value for the organization, then, if you're going to be optimistic about it, then I think we have the potential to unlock some new capabilities in people and organizations. I think, and it sounds like from the research, people are still tending towards that optimistic view as well, which is good. I don't think anybody's looking at the march of the robots over the horizon just yet. I think that's
No, despite all the excitement in the press about that idea, I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. And even, I was talking recently with this woman who was head of machine learning at Carnegie Mellon. She's now gone to a big bank to play, the same role. But she said when she went to Carnegie Mellon in the mid-1980s, everybody was saying, oh, autonomous vehicles are just around the corner. We have prototypes. It's really going to be any day now. And we're still saying that today. So these things happen more slowly than anybody anticipates.
Yeah. The autonomous vehicle conversation is obviously very relevant to supply chains and logistics and this sort of thing. And I'm thinking about some of the more practical applications of AI technology in the manufacturing supply chain space, where a lot of our audience and members are operating. And you look at some of the kind of operations changes that might take place over the next few years. What are the big wins that you think might be possible through implementing AI, either on the factory floor or in the logistics operations side?
Let's talk about that autonomous vehicles issue, because I do think that, it will happen first in relatively kind of fenced off areas within large organizations. You already see it, for example, in mining oriented vehicles where, they own all the property, they're not going on public roads, and it works pretty well, and in many cases leads to greater safety. And I think even for things like trucking and so on, we'll see partial implementations of it. Maybe, a long distance truck will have a driver, but the driver can sleep while the autonomous capabilities are, driving overnight. And then when it comes into a city and has to negotiate streets or bad weather or something like that, the human driver will take over. So, or there will be some sort of remote ability to take over with a human. So I think we'll see those kinds of hybrids before we see anything fully autonomous. And in factories, I think the big opportunity is coordinating a lot of things that were previously uncoordinated. This digital twin idea that, either for individual machines or ultimately, I think for entire factories, we'd have a digital twin of it and we'd be able to understand patterns much better and anomalies and so on. Predictive maintenance is already pretty far along, certainly with AI. In the book, I talk about this company, Big River Steel, that kind of a brand new steel mill in Arkansas that has worked with a AI firm to really support key functions of the plant with AI in a way that it never has before. And I've talked to a number of companies in the steel industry, and who knows how it will succeed, but it has a lot of people's attention.
Yeah. I mean, they describe themselves as a technology company that happen to make steel, I think, which is fairly bold way of kind of projecting what we do. So again, going back to that kind of pragmatic step-by-step approach, where do you think manufacturing organizations and leaders might start to look for the first wins or the low-hanging fruit in this arena?
I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff happening in the kind of demand forecasting space. That's always been a real hit or miss activity, but now there's a lot more external data available. You can start to look at the things that use your product and see, you know, what's the consumption of those. I talk in the book a little bit about this company Exojet. It's not manufacturing, but they have, you know, physical assets to deploy. Now there's a database of where every chartered jet is in the world. And so you can say, well, I'm going to not put mine where everybody else's are, and also charge more if I have some exclusivity in my location. So that issue of using external data for demand prediction, I think, is a hot one that's going to grow a lot over the next several years. I think obviously there are logistical applications, pricing. I've always said with analytics that if you want to make money fast with analytics, the best way to do it is pricing. And there are, I mean, machine learning certainly is a technology that can be used in pricing. It's not much of an extension of what was previously done with dynamic pricing with regular analytics, but it is a bit of one. So to me, those are some of the big areas that we'll see more of. And of course, robotics is going to change, I think, pretty dramatically. We'll have much smarter robots than we ever had before. Some vendors are working on ways that the robots can start collaborating with each other. That's actually my next book. I decided I'd written 20 nonfiction business books, so I'm going to write a fictional novel about robotic American football, because I don't really, you know, I grew up in the South. I don't know that much about real football, but I know a lot about American football. And you may have heard that our football players sort of bash their brains into mush in the sport. So I think people will be looking for how robots might take it over.
Maybe we won't have as many commercial breaks then.
That would be good. They could just keep on playing. They don't need any rest.
So you talk about data, you know, and also in the book, I wanted to ask you, how important or what kind of role does data play in the cognitive equation? And what can companies do today to prepare for a better data environment?
It's absolutely critical. And, you know, sometimes it's internal data, sometimes it's external. For machine learning, at least in business-oriented applications, not that are, you know, well out of the lab, labeled data is very critical. So you need to know what, for the particular outcome that you're trying to predict or classify, for your training data, you have to know what that outcome was. And that can be, I think, quite difficult if you have to get humans to go through and classify it for you. It's quite labor intensive. You know, maybe you have some data from the past for which you know what the outcome is, and you can use that as your labeled data, but having labeled data is absolutely critical. And kind of the more sophisticated your AI methods are, the more data you need. So if you decide you want to do some deep learning based image recognition for, you know, defective products going by you on the manufacturing line, you better have a clearly labeled set of products that have been defective in the past and what they look like, so that you can train your image recognition tools with deep learning. Deep learning can require, you know, millions of data elements.
Yeah, there's a couple of conversations I've had recently with sort of digital leaders where they've said the number one thing that organizations should be doing now is collecting their data. Even if they don't have a specific application for it in mind, trust me, you will need it in the future. You will wish you had it going back 3 years, 4 years.
Do you think companies are swimming in more data now than they have been in a long time, or collecting more?
Yes, I mean, we have all these transactional systems in place, ERP, CRM, et cetera. Financial systems are very mature now. There's all the online internet related data, click streams, and so forth. There's a fair amount of data from the external environment that you can either buy or get through open data kinds of things from governments. So yes, we definitely are. And I think it's a struggle for many organizations to figure out how to use it all. But in general, I agree with you, Tim, that you should, I mean, you may not want to accumulate data on, I don't know, how many rolls of toilet paper you're using or something. But if it has any relationship to the core of your business, I think it makes sense to collect it now, even if you're not going to use it now.
So that's, I guess, partly a question of leadership, whether you've got a chief digital officer, a chief data officer. Some organizations may not have those because of a legacy, but to be fit for the future, that's something that they should be thinking about, I sense.
Yeah, there's a great old story about a bank in the United States, a very successful and highly analytical bank called Capital One, and some new owners or managers came in to run it, basically, who had this idea, we're going to use information to really change the way we do business. And they needed all the past data on credit card offers and so on, so they could sort of see what worked and what didn't. And the people said, sorry, you know, we put that on computer tapes and we write over it to save the $22 a tape that it would cost. So they were horrified, as you can imagine. Jeff Bezos always says, we never throw away data at Amazon. It's worked pretty well for him so far, I would say.
Yeah, we'll follow his lead, right?
I think that's a pretty good example to follow. So from a practical perspective for supply chain and manufacturing directors setting up their teams for the future, you know, would that include someone with data capabilities, and what are the kind of skill sets should they be looking for in hiring people for these teams to prepare them for the cognitive implementation?
And are they out there in enough numbers?
Well, they are not out there in enough numbers today, but I think there is a lot of analytical talent available. I was talking recently to the organization that accredits business schools around the world, and they counted up over 400 master's programs in analytics or big data just in business schools, and there are other sources of them as well. So that's a pretty good place to start. You should at least be doing more with analytics, if not AI. And then, you know, interestingly, I think people who do this sort of work are not immune from being automated themselves. So I talk in the book about automated machine learning capabilities. I just did a little study on that for a vendor, and it's quite interesting. The kinds of skills that people are increasingly saying they need is, we need people who understand the business and who understand our customers and who are certainly data literate, but they may not have to have PhDs in statistics or something like that, because the machine is increasingly doing that. It's figuring out what algorithms fit the data best and explaining why that particular person was classified in a certain category, and even then, you know, spitting out some APIs that you can link into your production system. So understanding the business, I think, is the single most important thing, and then clearly some sort of quantitative orientation is very helpful.
And then hopefully the next iterations of the technology will in some ways democratize AI itself, so that, I mean, you mentioned a couple of examples where I think it's Airbnb have kind of developed an AI system that allows the kind of whiteboard sketching and ideation sessions to actually be converted into code. And I think if we can democratize the data process, the coding process to that degree, we can all be involved in the process in some way, which is a very exciting outlook for the future, potentially.
Yeah, the citizen data scientist, people refer to that whole concept. And I think it is a reality.
Yeah.
And I think you mentioned in the book as well about individuals preparing themselves for, I mean, you talk about businesses preparing for the cognitive implementation. So having sort of training schools and centers of cognitive, et cetera. But you also talk about people preparing themselves for that. How would people go about doing that?
Well, there are a pretty vast array of learning resources. You know, there's so many online MOOCs, online courses that you can take about machine learning and so on, and people kind of certify themselves. And, you know, I believe it's important for organizations to start to tell their employees what to do in this regard and give them some advice. But in general, I think individuals know best what their current skills are. Yeah. They can sort of sense maybe the way the world is going and how they might evolve, and that direction. But that was really the focus of my last book, Only Humans Need Apply, that you need to sort of think about what's your general strategy, which of 5 we outlined are you going to adopt for working alongside smart machines, and then pursue one of those.
I'm interested in sort of flipping that on its head a bit, because we're talking about people using AI. I'm interested in AI using people and some of the ethical considerations around it. I appreciate we could probably fill an hour's conversation just talking about the ethics of AI, but as it stands, you feel that the technology is heading in a direction where it's kind of self-regulating, or ultimately can you see a need for something that's a bit more structured around this so that we don't go off down some worrying routes using AI for, you know, profiling and this kind of stuff?
Yeah, well, of course, that varies a lot by geography. So I think Europe has been, to my mind, smarter about it. And I think the GDPR regulations are a step in the right direction. And some smart companies in the US are saying, we're gonna do that everywhere, even though we only have to do it in Europe. So in the US, we don't have much regulation of this at all. And we start to see the impact with all the things happening at Facebook and Google and so on. So I think enterprises need some help from governments, and they should probably be asking for it rather than trying to resist it. I think it'll be good for them in the long run. This is the negativity about analytics and AI is a pretty new thing. It's only come up in the last year or two. So I'm not sure. My general belief is that individual consumers should ultimately own their own data, and they give it up. They should get something in exchange for it. Sometimes you do that. You get free software or whatever. I get a free Gmail email client that works pretty well as long as I'm letting them read my emails, and I know that, and it's fine with me.
Yeah.
But we all need to sort of think of it as a value exchange, and governments need to say, look, if you're going to use somebody's data, you have to get their permission to do it. Then there are also these transparency issues of, why did the algorithm decide that you deserve credit and somebody else doesn't? And that's pretty straightforward with traditional analytics, less straightforward with simple machine learning. It's virtually impossible with complex forms of machine learning like deep learning. So we need to figure out how do we make those things transparent. And researchers are working on it, but at the moment, it's not transparent at all. So I think if you're in a highly regulated industry, you just really can't, healthcare or financial services, you just really can't use those AI algorithms.
So I guess as we wrap things up, I'm interested in, you spend a lot of time researching, talking to people involved in this space. Are you very optimistic about AI and its impact on the world, both of commerce and society and whatever? You probably know as much as a lot of people. So how do you feel about it overall? If someone said yes or no, what's the value for you?
I am quite optimistic. I think it's going to take longer than many people argue, but maybe I think of AI as being evolutionary in the short run and revolutionary in the long run. Yeah. As we provide greater intelligence for more and more things that we do in business and organizational life. I think that's all to the good. I think we will at some point get to the point where we can treat cancer and have I'm hoping by the time I get too old to drive, there will be autonomous vehicles around by then. I think there are all sorts of societal benefits for this, and I'm not that worried as some people have been about, robot overlords starting to kill us all. I don't see that happening, at least in my lifetime. But I do think it's not a bad idea to start to put those sorts of put processes and policies in place that might prevent it from happening, even though I don't think it's realistic anytime soon.
And to wrap up, I guess, how we started, which is what you say in the book about the hype, but more importantly about whether or not companies should be doing something. again, thinking about our members, thinking about the journeys that they're on, some of them will probably agree with you with regards to the fact that they understand it's important, they understand it's something that they should be doing, but might be thinking maybe 5 years down the line, maybe 10 years down the line, what will happen with those organizations that don't embrace this cognitive revolution?
I think they will suffer and die in the sense that this seems to me a technology that's not well suited to being a fast follower, or certainly not a slow follower, because it does take a lot of learning. You do have to gather a lot of data. I think companies that decide in 5 years that, oh yeah, we really need to get with this AI thing may have lost a lot of ground. And it's not unlike what happened with previous generations of technology. You know, retailers that didn't adopt online commerce have suffered with regard to Amazon. Shippers that didn't realize that information was as important as the package itself have lost out to UPS and FedEx. Retailers that didn't care about logistics and supply chain have lost out to Walmart. So this, I think, will have similar effects on enterprises that don't really get with the program.
Well, one thing we haven't talked about briefly, I know I just said wrapped up, but is the, unlike, I guess, business models in the past, there's the whole disruptive companies, disruptive startups that are in the scene that are really throwing in a spanner in the works to some degree. Some of these guys are adopting cognitive far more readily than other companies
and
are.
Building around it.
And building around it and disrupting these large companies. So I guess added to the question I just asked you about companies that don't embrace AI and cognitive, where will they be versus those companies that are disruptive?
Well, yeah, I mean, you were talking about manufacturing before, and it turns out that manufacturing is not a highly valued business model in investment markets. You know, it tends to be 2 times revenues on average. If you take these platform-oriented companies, Uber and Airbnb and Facebook and so on, they're like 9 times revenues on average, and they can only do those business models with AI. So I think at the same time you're thinking about embracing AI, you should be thinking about, well, you know, clearly I'm not going to turn from a manufacturer to a platform company overnight, but maybe I can add some capabilities. Maybe I can start to sell somebody else's stuff in addition to mine, the way Amazon started to do with Amazon Marketplace. Maybe I can embrace some tech-oriented capabilities as GE has tried to do. I mean, that hasn't worked out terribly well so far, but I think it will eventually work out well for them. So diversifying your business model and using AI to do it, I think is a great idea. I
mean, the automotive sector is a great example there, isn't it? Where I think they're looking at completely revolutionizing, you know, looking at the servitization model. Will we all even own cars in 25 years time, or will we kind of, you know, on a pay to play sort of model? So I think we're seeing signs of it, but it's a way to go.
Yeah, it's slow. I was with the head of data and analytics for Ford this week, and they're certainly pursuing a very active and definite mobility oriented strategy so that they're well positioned by the time this comes. And GM is doing that as well, you know, a lot of car companies around the world. So they're smart, I think, to start transitioning.
Yeah. Well, I think hopefully this conversation's given the audience some thoughts and impetus into making some changes, not necessarily completely redefining their business model, but actually looking at picking off some of these automatable activities to free up their minds and time and bandwidth to do maybe some new innovative stuff as well. So,
and clearly, by reading your book and the practical and actionable advice that you give there, I think it sets a lot of companies in a good stead to be able to implement change within their businesses.
Great. Hope so. Thanks for your questions. They were great.
Thank you.
Yeah, Tom, thanks for joining us, and good luck with the book, and we'll see you on the other side when the robots are our overlords.
Great. Okay. See you.
Thanks, Tom. Bye-bye.